London.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, which
With the
part of
rest.
London are you in?
Southwest, just near Richmond Park.
Yeah, okay. We were there in like 2007, 2016 to 2017 on the Northern Line in a little place called Tufnell Park. I don't know if you're
Yep.
familiar with that, but
I
I'm
know roughly where that is. Yeah.
yeah, I get so sentimental. I've got a couple of. I'm in the comedy world now, and when
Yep.
I was there last, the world of comedy was not on my focus or priority list, and now I've got so many comics going over there who are making me jealous that I'm not
Yep.
back there. How long have you been in London for?
It was 2 years in September. So I've been yeah. So it was 2 years in September, and prior to that was 4 years in Amsterdam, and then yeah, bits of Australia. So I did most of my life in Brisbane. Moved to Geelong for med school. Did some time in Colac as part of med school, if you know where Colac is. So,
I do.
and then went to the Gold Coast for my internship. So moved around a bit.
Ah, nice, man. I'm in Point Lonsdale, which is
Oh,
about
awesome.
half an hour
Yeah,
away from Geelong. So I'm in Geelong
yeah.
every Friday night telling funny jokes and sometimes not that funny, but I know exactly
What?
where you were here and I know exactly when you say you did some time in Cole, like you mean it with every sense of that statement.
Yeah, I mean, I did a year out there. It was in my first clinical year of medical school, so it was actually pretty full on. It was actually quite nice to be in Colac because I could go home for lunch. I would literally walk out of the hospital across the road, grab lunch at home, have a coffee at home. So on some level, it was good. It was pretty isolating, but it was really nice. I was doing a lot of trail running at the time, so I'd get out to Forest for the weekend on a Sunday because it was only 45 minutes for an hour away, less, maybe half an hour from Colac, and Forest has just got the most unbelievable trails, and yeah, they're all mountain bike trails, but I used to see like two mountain bikers in 30 kilometers. So it was not a problem at all. And they had the Forest Brewery, had a really good breakfast afterwards. It was just, yeah, if, when people say like, what's some of the favorite parts of the world to run in, like Forest is certainly up there. So, yeah.
Yeah. Did you say Richmond in London? Like that's pretty well known for its running trails or running. Don't,
Yeah.
or have I just made
Richmond,
that up?
Richmond Park is a big running park. Like I'll run past any number of Olympians in Richmond Park. It links to Teddington and Bushy Park pretty well, and they all stay in Teddington. All the Aussies that travel stay in Teddington. So I sort of yeah, you bump into them occasionally. There's a bunch of elites. There's people running around. I don't know who they are, but you look at them, you're like, yeah, you're good. It doesn't take much to see them, like, because you're looking at them running, oh, you're hoofing it at 3:30 something, and you don't look like you're doing it tough here. So yeah, a lot of running around Richmond Park, as I said, links to Bushy Park, which is where a lot of the elites spend a lot of their time, and Teddington. And so then, but there's also a link that I use a lot to Wimbledon and Putney Common, which is a little bit more muddy and traily. So it's nice. I can get 30 Ks in without retracing my steps on dirt, which is pretty like a bit of a luxury in London. So yeah.
For sure, man. Oh, so you're still doing quite a lot of running yourself.
Yeah, I'm getting about 100 Ks a week at the moment. So not bad. I ran London last year in 2:42 and enjoyed it. Ran, like, had a blinder. I think I negatively split by a couple of seconds, like the perfect race. It was really tough because when you run a marathon like that, you're pretty much riding the line the whole time. It gets really tough. Obviously, if you blow up, it's really bad. But if I'd had quite a few where I'd done a good job of negatively splitting by a couple of minutes, which actually doesn't feel so hard, to be honest. Doesn't get too hard till late. But when you're right on the line like I was, and I had pretty much the perfect day, I was really it was really tough. And I just thought, you know what, I'm going to take a step back for a while. So this year I've done a little bit less of that. I did a 50K at Lavaredo. I still enjoy the trail world. I've done quite a few halves, which has been fun, and had to have some time off. Like I had a lesion cut out on my shin, and yeah, anyway, so I had to have some time off running. So anyway, it's been good to take a sort of half step back and make sure you still want to do it, and you're still doing it if you can't race and all those things. So it's been good though.
Yeah. How do you find that balance between? I often wonder this sometimes with myself. I love running my whole day, whether I'm out there training or whether I'm at home working. Like my world is just like, oh, okay, I've spent 12 hours on running today and have barely blinked an eye. I mean, for the most part, it's something I enjoy because I guess from like this side of the computer or this side of the training that I'm referring to, a lot of it's actually planning others' training, and it's a bit less emotionally draining than what it is planning your own training when like you can take a half a step back and see things a little more clearly. Sometimes I find when I'm working on an athlete's program or race plan or whatever it might be, but it sounds like in some regard you're probably playing a similar game, but from a different angle to what I am with that same balance.
Yeah, I do spend a lot of time. I mean, look, I sort of sit across health and performance, so I do get a little bit of half a foot out. Although it is something I'm working on, is trying to diversify out. You've got comedy is a great example. I mean, the closest thing I might have is coffee. I yeah, would like to diversify out and sort of have a few more interests and a few more things that are not related to achievement, performance, health, and physical performance specifically. I mean, interestingly, before running, well, after initially running, I ran sort of badly ran middle distance in high school and okay ran some cross country, or ran cross country to an okay level, not so good on the track. Quit just after school and started, I was 18-year-old bloke working as a strength and conditioning coach. You start lifting weights, and I got serious into that world for a while. I was, I did some Olympic lifting, I did some power lifting, I did some strongman training, and you sort of think that you're going to stay in that world in the same way that I feel like I'm going to stay in the running world at the moment, but with an eye on the fact that that can change, and that's a good thing because it allows you to be a beginner again. But I say all that to say, I haven't always been in the running world, but I've always been in the physical world, and I think every now and again I get, whether it's an injury or a setback, I'm like, do I really want to keep running? Do I want to take a step back and just go back to non-performance based stuff, just train for health? Because like I would be training probably at least 6 hours a week, maybe 7 hours a week, regardless of performance aspirations. I would do something every day for at least half an hour, and most of it more than that. So I sort of vacillate on this, and if you catch me on a bad day, it'll be, oh yeah, I'm going to step away, but I keep sort of coming back at this stage, and we'll see.
Yeah. Man, it's funny you say it. I mean, I've played that exact same game. So everyone who listens to the podcast will be sick of the story, but for your own sake, about 2 years ago, I decided to get back into some more competitive running. And when I did, it had been about 7 or 8 years away from the sport. And so for whatever reason, because it was what I'd always done, I just got back involved, and I was like, this is pretty much how I trained. And my body was just like, what are you doing, mate? So I navigated my way through a few calf strains. But what was so interesting was after a couple of calf strains, before I really figured out what was going on, I was saying the same thing. I'm like, oh man, how much do I really want to be a part of this? But then as a part of my daily routine, exactly like you, I'm like, well, I'm training, I'm running, and I'm getting fitter. I can see the improvement anyway. So it's like, it's a double-edged sword. It's like, oh, you've sucker punched yourself into wanting to remain running because, I mean, whether you're doing it for time or doing it for fitness, the truth is you're going to be doing it. So I definitely sympathize with you there, man. But one thing, dude, I thought maybe as a bit of a foundation to get this baby rolling, because I've had a good look through your website and I've got my head around what it is that you do to, a pretty good extent. But I think that might be a nice way to introduce. Yeah, it makes a nice way of introduction because you're a man of many talents, and I always enjoy watching a man of many talents answer the question about what it is that he actually does. So good luck to you.
Yeah, it's hard to, I've had to work on this candidly. Branding and personal brand, all those things. It's not something Australians like talking about, and it's actually, the tall poppy syndrome in Australia is real, and it can be quite hard as somebody who spent most of my life in Australia trying to do this. But I can, on the international stage, if you're not doing it, it's a real struggle. So look, the way I pitch myself is somebody who sits between health and performance. I sort of look at that niche because I think most people want a portion of both. Most people aren't 100% performance, and most people aren't 100% health. So everyone sits on that spectrum somewhere between them, but most people sit somewhere in the middle. So I help navigate that space is kind of what I look at it. And then in my background, as I said, did some exercise physiology, or I studied exercise physiology with podiatry in Australia, worked as a podiatrist briefly, then went into medicine. So I sort of have that coaching background, S&C, health prescription, and then into true clinical medicine as well. And look, I started coaching in 2005. I was, straight out of school, 17 years old, started coaching then. So I've been coaching for north of 20 years now, across team sports, strength and conditioning, endurance sports, all of it. So, and then, as I said, my personal journey kind of went from track through strength sports, and then back into sort of marathoning, ultramarathoning. So I kind of, that's that navigation path there. I was coaching. So I was working as a doctor in Australia on the Gold Coast, met my now wife while I was traveling in my internship. She was American living in Amsterdam. We met in Switzerland. One day we'll sell that story to Disney. But after that, I thought, I sort of wanted to sit my US medical exams anyway, and was going to take a year of trying to do that. So it sort of coincided with me deciding, listen, I'm going to take some time off work, do some locum work, which is basically supply teaching, but for doctors. And so I did that in Australia, earned enough money to go see her to see if it worked in Amsterdam. I figured I'd go to Amsterdam, see if it worked with her. If it didn't, I was still in Amsterdam, had a fun time, and could go back to Australia and pick up my doctor's job and sort of continue on the path towards the US medical exams. if it went well, we'd see what happened. And I sat my US medical exams in Amsterdam, all went well. I was really enjoying spending time with her. So I was like, listen, I'm going to stay here. So yeah, made that work and figured pretty quickly after sitting those exams, actually, I need to meet some Dutch people and learn some Dutch. And so started getting back into coaching team sports there, specifically rugby league and then rugby union. And then, oh, you got an Australian accent, you know about rugby, come do this. And it was true, but it wasn't fair. But anyway, ended up coaching I coached a club at top level there in Amsterdam, which is not particularly high, but an okay level. I was running a rugby academy there and coaching an underage national team. And I had a Ted Lasso moment where I was like having nightmares, stressed out, and my wife just said, "You don't need to be doing this." So stepped away pretty much at the beginning of COVID, and then started working for a US tech company called Supersapiens. They made continuous glucose monitors for athletes and got involved there. And then once you're in the tech and startup worlds, kind of everyone thinks you know what you're doing in that world. It's like you don't need much experience before everyone thinks you know what you're doing. So I've sort of been in that space since, in that sort of tech startup world. And yeah, it's been good. It's fun. It probably resonates with my personality better. It's very dynamic, lots of uncertainty, lots of getting stuff done and working it out and finding a way rather than heavy bureaucracy, which I really struggle with in the healthcare system, especially in Australia where, there's a lot of that sort of infrastructure in place. So yeah, it's been good. It's been challenging. It's been growth. It's been learning. It's all those things that I enjoy and allows me to, in some part call running part of work. Right. So that's been helpful as well.
Yeah,
And
it's
then I guess,
I mean the
sorry
where
to,
no, go
Sorry, I
on.
was going to say, to complete that off, I guess, sorry, I realized that I left a bit out where I started podcasting as part of that role and now do a ton of content. So I podcast, I said my own podcast with a co-host of mine called 1% Better, Hidden Stories in Sport. We sort of talk about some sports science. I host a couple of podcasts for other people, the Norwegian Method podcast, talking to the sort of Norwegian triathletes and their coach. And then I produce Tom Evans's ultrasound podcast as well. So sort of that podcasting content space and my own newsletter writing as well has been, a lot of what I've been doing recently.
That's funny. As you sort of gave an overview of what it is that you do for work, I couldn't help but notice like a lot of the things that you're talking about now are very popular subjects. Like they're quite popular. I love that you've just topped it off with hosting the Norwegian Method podcast, because that's another topic that if you type that into YouTube or you make a YouTube video about it, you're guaranteed a few views. Man, the wearables, I think, I'm trying to remember exactly what point of entry I came to your name, but I remember early when I reached out to you, I mentioned Marco Altini. I think maybe he mentioned you on a podcast we did a while ago, or you mentioned him. But the wearables in technology is one which has kind of gained my attention a little bit by surprise, because I think until about 18 months ago, I could not have cared less about running with a watch. Like at the bare minimum, I just had no interest running. I'll just go out. I'll be like, all right, run for 30 minutes there, run for 50 minutes. And then through the nature of doing this podcast, every second guest that came on would talk about wearables and would talk about data points. And I found myself kind of nerding out on it a little bit and being like, oh, like what is this HRV? And what are some of these points that I could monitor? And now I've kind of had to just take a step back and go, Tice, mate, like the other side of this coin still exists. Like you're allowed to run just because you enjoy it, not just because there's so many data points you can monitor and graph and whatever else there might be. So that would be one that I'd love to put a little bit of a thumbtack in and just spend a bit of time, because I've noticed, as I've just mentioned through what I've said, that it's become a scene which is, there seems to be a lot of people who come from a similar standpoint as me who have now started to become quite interested. And I think like there's a variety of reasons for that. Obviously, like the education's coming out about it, but more than that, like the entertainment factor of some of these wearables is so enjoyable. Like they've done a great job of captivating the attention and gamifying some of this stuff. And so, I mean, very loose-ended handball of a question, but maybe you could speak to the idea of wearables a little bit and we can let you guide the direction of this conversation. Because as you say, like, you've got yourself a few steps ahead of where I'm at in this technology. So I'm sure there's plenty more going on than what I even realized.
Yeah, I think we're a roughly similar age. We probably were running before GPS watches existed, right? I was running track before GPS watches existed. I was horrible. I could never pace myself. Didn't know what was going on. Ran with a guy who was metronomic. If you told him to run whatevers, he would run them splits on the track. If you asked him how far we'd run, while we were running along. He would tell you how far we'd run. He could tell you how fast we were running on a cross country course or whatever. So I ran with that guy, and I was like, I'm not there, and I can't feel this, right? So I think there's a generation of people probably, more like you and him, who would just had a really good feel for this stuff, and then there was, the other people like me who just kind of couldn't do that, and that's fine. I think there's those people like you, who are coming to wearables where you're like, I don't need this, but I think it's a nice to have in your case. And I think as we age, every consumerism's real, right? So these are gadgets, they're fun to play with, they give you interesting metrics and fun achievements, and they understand. And I've done part of this. Like, you understand what people want to see. The gamification is the hot word for it, where you're sort of I wouldn't say hacking, but sort of utilizing the dopamine system to really give people rewards for things like run streaks or completing rings or whatever you want to call it, right? Sort of, you get your, Training Peaks gives you your fitness and your fatigue and all these things. So that's certainly one part of it, and I think it's helpful. I think the other part is probably the new runner who's coming to it, who doesn't know anything and has just started running, perhaps using Strava on their phone, and is now like, oh, I can get a watch to do this. That's more convenient. And then they start to get involved with that, and they start to listen to podcasts or whatever, and they start to get like bought into the wearables. There's certainly a group of people who probably sit between them, where the wearables are sort of ubiquitous in their running or triathlon or trail running or whatever it is they do, and it's part of what keeps them involved. And I think we tend to dismiss this group that enjoy the tinkering and the gadgets as part of what they do. And I think triathlon, and to some extent trail running, but more so triathlon, really leverages this community, right? Gear is a big part of triathlon, and whether that's shoes or bikes or computers or watches or the latest sweat sensor or a continuous glucose monitor, that's a big part of it, and the data is heavily informed. I think running probably still romanticizes purism a bit more. It's a bit more of a pure sport, and they love to, and runners love to like think about it's just a pair of running shoes, except you also have to have a Garmin, and now we have to have this and a belt, and so I think, if gun to my head, where are wearables helpful, right? Let's go there. And I think what they can help do is they give, Stephen Seiler's is a very good exercise physiologist. He's from Texas originally, now in Norway, and he talks about the 3 Ps, and I really like the paradigm. So there's the performance, which is like how fast you're running. There's a physiology, so something like heart rate. So it's an internal metric, sometimes called external and internal metrics. So the external metric is the load that you're sort of doing, right? It's paces, it's distances, it's whatever. The internal is how your body's responding to that, which is modified by things like sleep and nutrition status and stress and all those things, right? On a hot day, heart rate is higher for the same pace, right? So it's the physiology, and then there's the perception, which is how you feel. And ideally, you want to dial that perception in so that you understand pacing properly, right? And you can perform optimally. But that requires feedback, and that's where the wearables come in, is we can start to get some feedback there. And then there's also a prescription of training, which is what the realm you live in as a coach, and you can prescribe external loads, or you can prescribe internal loads, or you can modify externals based on what you've seen internally, right? So you can say, hey, we're taking your lactate, it's too high, we should slow down, right? And so that's a way to modify things, because ultimately we use external internal loads as though they're one and the same, but they really aren't. So running 10Ks at 4-minute pace isn't the same in the heat as it is in the cold, as it is over the hills, as it is whatever else. So we use it as a rough surrogate, but it's not always the case. And it's not the training you can do, it's the training you can adapt to that's important. And so generally most coaches probably prescribe training on a conservative end. And so it's not as big a problem. But when you get to the top end, and you start to get to the pointy end of these people who are doing perhaps 300 kilometers a week, as Calvin Kipton was, or you're doing 30 hours a week, as some of these triathletes are, like, you don't have a lot of room forever. If you're out by a couple of percent, that's, it's catastrophic potentially.
Yeah, well, that you've just touched on it beautifully. And I think one thing that I struggled with, even though I thought I was strong at it, was, you'd say go out and run a pace. I could. You say, how do you feel at this pace? I'd be able to tell you pretty accurately how it was I felt. But one thing that I reckon I caught myself doing when I did start wearing just Garmin and a heart rate monitor a little more, was saying, that internal gauge of, all right, like this is relatively easy, but then looking at the heart rate and going, oh, but you said it was going to be a zone 2 run. It looks like you're pushing, higher on the stage 3 end of things. And as you said, like, I'm not necessarily on the hunt I'm definitely not on the hunt to run at any Olympics or anything anymore. I'm simply out there for enjoyment. But when it comes to actually allowing my body to make some physiological changes so I can go out and run consistently, that's one area that I kept catching myself letting myself down. And I know this for a fact of having worked with so many athletes now is I think nearly every athlete is a culprit for labeling something an easy run when, some of the data points might suggest it's not quite what they recognize. So from that perspective, I've also found it a really helpful tool just to accompany the running.
Yeah, I think track runners really struggle to run easy because they don't know what it's like, because they don't, unless they're from a high volume program, and even if they are, and I'm talking like 100-mile week high volume track programs, they tend to run a lot of their easy running quite fast just by virtue of mentality and fiber type and all those things. I found that to be the case. Whereas people who perhaps are more cross country focused initially probably run track because they have to and are more cross country focused or similar, tend to be able to run a little bit easier. But also, I'll be honest, my easy runs now are easier than they were when I was much slower. So I think it's part of what you develop. And I think part of that is just giving up on the watch, or not giving up it, but ignoring the watch and going, I need to run easy today. And as volume accumulates, or as you do more volume, you just slow down because you just can't run that much. You just feel beaten up. So there's certainly that component to it. I also think, beginner runners tend to think that you need to be tired. Thinking about it from an exercise versus training perspective, training is about positive movement towards a goal. We're trying to achieve a certain goal, in which case it's not about this session, it's about the long-term goal and how they all fit together. So then you start to take it easier. But if you're just exercising, you just want a good workout, like go out and punch 5Ks. Most people, I actually reflected on this a little while ago. I can't remember where I was. I was in Belgium actually at a conference. I remember this now. And I saw this guy hammering down the street wearing like a cotton t-shirt and some like, I don't know what shoes, like clearly not running shoes, or more casual shoes, and just having like breathing really hard, pouring sweat, phone in his hand, headphones on, hammering along. And I texted some of my mates. I was like, I kind of miss that, where you could just go out and I'm just exercising. I have no goals here. I'm just going to go hammer it and just do a fast 5K or something. And I think if we come from that, it can be quite hard to then run easy, because we think that is, even if we ease off a little bit on that, we're still breathing hard and all those things. When, once you understand physiology, that's probably closer to, second threshold than it is first threshold, let alone below first threshold. So yeah, it's something I miss about that, just being able to just really go for it. But yeah, I mean,
That is true. As soon as you find yourself in the door of distance running, I've got one bloke from our local footy club here, Tom, and he's just, I've started coaching him as of maybe 3 weeks ago, and he's been doing pretty well for 6 months or so. He's a retired footballer. Probably his words, he would have explained himself as slightly overweight originally. He's looking good now. But the constant conversation we have is he wants to run 45 minutes for 10K in April. And so every training session that he goes out to now, whether it's an easy run or a session, he's like, why aren't we hitting 4.5 minute K pace? And that is a really interesting dynamic to try and explain. Like that mindset that you kind of just touched on is so prevalent in, I mean, I catch myself doing it. I've been in the sport now for 25 years, and from time to time, I'm like, wait, how am I going to run this for a marathon if I can't hit these 8x1Ks in this particular time? So
yep.
I get that it's there. But the idea that there can be a place for actually slower running and that can have benefits which correlate to faster running still seems to catch a lot of people off guard. So whether it's like an education or a feel. The other thing he often mentions to me is like zone 2 running feels almost impossible to him. And I'd love to pick your brain around this. He's running, yeah. So he's running with this is interesting. He's running with a Garmin wristwatch. He doesn't have a heart strap or anything on. So from my experience, my Garmin wristwatch always, or monitor, always suggests that I'm 15, 20 beats above what I actually am when I strap a heart rate monitor on. So I often wonder how much of it is that. But
so it's probably,
maybe you could talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, it's probably cadence locking. So it's probably giving you a cadence, not your heart rate. So it's probably giving you about 180 when you're running at 180 cadence. So the way that the technology works, it's called PPG, photoplasmography. It's ubiquitous. It's what Rings use. It's what Whoop uses, all of them, right? The Chorus armband, any of that stuff. It's all using the same tech, which is basically, to keep it really simple, it bounces light in and looks for the reflection of that light back. Now that will change based on the pulse of your arteries. It's using that tech. Now, that tech is well established. It's what they use in hospitals when they put that thing on your finger, the pulse oxygen probe. It gets heart rate, it gets oxygen saturations, all that stuff. The problem with it is measurement and where you're measuring. So even Whoop has acknowledged this and has brought out clothing, right? So they let you wear, women have got crop tops that you can put it in, men have got shorts that you can put it in. So they've realized that, the wrist isn't a good spot for this because the anatomy is not that consistent and there's quite a bit of movement in your wrist. So what I would say is, Garmin seems to think they're getting better at this, and I've had some reports that's the case. I'll believe it when I see the research on it. In my experience, my understanding of the tech from a basic science perspective, you're better off measuring it with something else. So I use that tech. I use an optical heart rate monitor. I don't use chest strap because I get chafed to high heaven with it, but I use it on my forearm, upper forearm on the inside. And I mean, you probably can't see my tan line from it, but I have a forearm tan line from it. So I think that tech is good. It's just about where you're using it and where you're applying it. So yeah, forearm, upper arm is fine. Wrist is generally not a good spot. Finger is actually really good because it's got 4 arteries in a consistent spot for everybody, and they're very close to the skin. So rings can work. It's just that the contact with rings isn't great because you have to be able to take them on and off, right? So they can't be tight. So yeah, it's kind of the long and the short of it is he's probably cadence locking, or at least in some part, or it's probably the watch is moving around and it's creating a problem. So yeah.
Yeah. And so would that be the reason that he's not running at zone 2? Like when you responded that, no, he's probably not. He probably can't. Is that why? Or is it more of a fitness thing?
Both. Probably both. It's probably his heart rate is probably high, artificially inflated, but he's also probably either unable to from a psychological perspective of like that's not running fast enough, right? Because there's no reward for running slowly on a football field. Doesn't matter what code you're playing. There's no reward for it. And generally that mentality, especially in Australian sport, is like, mate, if you're not running hard, like, so there's a lot of go hard or go home that I think influences it. But also when many people start running, they're probably, I mean, you've had Phil Maffetone on your podcast, like he's the king of this. Like many people can't run in zone 2 when they start. It's just zone 3 or more. And there's different perspectives on that. Phil would say, you got to run zone 2 to get it better there, and you got to start slow and stay low and all that. And I'm kind of a little bit more, probably a little bit more liberal with it, which is kind of just, you will get fitter. I don't think there's magic that happens in zone 2. I understand the physiology is very different, and I understand that at an elite level and at a high level, when you're running lots of kilometers, you need to keep things easy. But I think if you're running 3 times a week, worrying about how intense that is, like, I'm not convinced. I think build a level of consistency, and then the outcome we see, this polarized trainings and all this sort of stuff, is probably an output of what's required. I think most people can sustain running hard somewhere between 2 and 3 times a week, right? How much is in that? How much volume is in those sessions will be varied, but you can do a good amount 2 to 3 times a week. Beyond that, you start needing to add in easier sessions, and then you start to polarize naturally. But I think to say somebody can only do 10 or 20% of their running hard if they're running 3 times a week is like, it's a little bit self-defeating. I think let's not build a cake out of the icing. Let's, the fundamental is consistency, like run a lot and run regularly. And then once we start to talk about that, we can start to talk about how do we split this up? What does this look like? It doesn't need to be different than a fartlek, or just go out and run as hard as you can for 20 minutes. Like, it doesn't need to be more complicated than that when you're just starting out. And then we can talk about sessions and times and paces and heart rates and lactates and all that stuff. But I think let's not overcomplicate it for the beginners. Like, get out there and enjoy your running and build some consistency and ask for help from people, whether it's other runners or coaches or something like that.
Yeah, maybe we'll zoom into this a little bit, because from what I understand, I think a large percentage of the people who listen to this podcast would put themselves in the first couple of years of their running experience. And I mean, you said it earlier that consumerism is real. And I mean, there's so many runners out there you can see with that classic saying, all the gear and no idea. It's funny that we lean into, or we jump into this idea, maybe with excitement or anticipation or a combination of both. It's interesting how many fields it exists where you want to do well, and it's almost like an extension of our desire to do well is the purchases of the products, which we assume is going to help us achieve that goal. But as we've sort of established, like, running is, if you want it to be, a very pure, very relaxed, very easy sport to get started with. And I think sometimes almost that lack of obstacle to get started is kind of intimidating to people. I'm not sure if you can talk to that at all. But as a new athlete who has been around for a couple of years and is potentially overwhelmed by all of this experience, I mean, when it comes to wearables, there's no one, I'm sure, that knows better. When it comes to the health side of running, there's probably no one who knows better than you. Like, are there any just ground rules or foundational elements that you would say, hey, focus on these before you start worrying about all the superfluous purchases and stuff, which probably aren't actually going to benefit your running results?
Yeah, I don't want to throw too many stones at the purchases or anything like that. Some people I'm pretty conservative with my buying, despite the fact that I'm a massive technophile and I love this stuff. I'll be very conservative with what I buy and what I use. But uh, what I'd say is if that's the stuff you need to get out the door, then that's a win, right? Just like if you want to jog in super shoes and that makes your experience better and it means you're going to run more, awesome, go for it. Like I'm not one of those people who's super judgy about it. Um, do I think everyone should spend all their time in super shoes? Absolutely not. But if it's the difference between you running and not running, go for it. You know what I mean? Like let's keep the main thing the main thing. We want more people doing more activity in general, certainly running as well. So I'd say if someone said to me like, ironically, we tend to major in the minutia. It's the podcast world, it's social media, it's all that stuff. It's what sells, it's the minutia. We create arguments where there aren't arguments. We create divide amongst the 5% of things we disagree on, right? Thinking about it, so we'll go from elite level down. There's all sorts of buzz around, should we be training like the Kenyans or the Norwegians or the whatever? Like they all got into the final, right? The Australians, so Stuart, let's say maybe not this last year, but let's say Stuart McSwain's there. You've got Ingebrigtsen from Norway, and you've got take your pick of Kenyans that are elite at the time. Yeah, Timothy Chariot, right? Timothy Chariot is probably doing tons of Kenyan style training with 20 by 1 minute on, 1 minute off, and all sorts of stuff at altitude over hills and rolling dirt, and he's jogging super slow. We know what Stewie's doing because it's well published, right? He does 8 by K, does a hilly tempo. Like, Stewie's training is no secret, and it's the same all year round. 30-minute threshold on Thursday, hills on a Saturday, and then like a bit of a long run on a Sunday. And Jakob's got double thresholds and all this. Now they're all there, so all roads lead to Rome. So then you go, well, what's consistent amongst them that is non-negotiable, and then what's different, right? And so how you chop up your intensity and do that, it's probably not super important. But what is important is consistency, and then you're looking for that consistency to build volume, right? So you just want to run consistently. That's what's going to be the first, second, and third parts. So like steps 1, 2, 3 in success is just consistency and doing that for a long time. You can rinse and repeat the same program like Stewie does, right? And that will create, by just stacking those weeks, that's going to create some success as well. So I think everyone should strive for a level of consistency. And then from there, you start to talk about, okay, am I doing enough training? What does that training look like? How do I improve that training from there? And then now we talk about intensities and sessions and all those things. But yeah, consistency is the bedrock on which this all sits. And that's roughly volumes per week. Obviously, you don't want to progress it too quickly. If you want to use a 10% rule, you can. If you want to use acute to chronic workload ratios, you can. Like, all models are wrong. Some models are useful. So it's just whatever works for you. Right? I found for me, the acute to chronic workload ratio works a little bit better than the 10% rule. So I use a 4-week rolling average, and I try not to increase that too much on this current week compared to my last 4 weeks. And I that way it keeps me honest with respect to having had time off. It's that simple. And I try and progress it a little bit and keep my sessions. I do about 8 to 10 Ks of work in both of my sessions. And then I do a long run. And then when I roll into marathon season, it's all my sessions become marathon specific. And that's, that goes into, they get built into long runs. Like, it's not complicated. If you looked at my training, you'd be like, oh, that's super boring and vanilla and not complicated. And it's like, I don't need that. I don't need to be complicated, because if you get complicated early, you rob yourself twice, right? So if you're just starting out and you start with a double threshold, like, you've robbed yourself twice. You've robbed yourself of all the gains you get from doing basic training, and you rob yourself of the gains when you need to use that Norwegian double threshold method, and you've already maxed it out for yourself already.
Yeah. So what would the difference in your training volume be in like a base period as opposed to like a 12 to 16 week marathon build-up?
It'd be pretty similar, to be honest. Like the variance, the difference between my heavy and light weeks, volume-wise, if we think about it just from a number of kilometers run, my volume will be similar based solely on when I last deloaded a little bit. I might bump it up a little bit. It might be, so the most I've ever run in a week consistently is 110, maybe 115 Ks, and I'm running 100 Ks a week at the moment, so it's not greatly different. I'm pacing a friend to London in April, so I'll train for that, but won't be as big. I'm running New York next November, and for that, I'll probably look to hit maybe 120 Ks a week if I'm feeling good with that. So, I mean, the real thing is, the realistic thing we talked about before is it's about how I adapt to stress, right? And the stress I'm imposing. But let's be real, for most people, most of their stress isn't coming from training. It's just the stress that we can modify, right? Most of the stress in most people's lives is absolutely not training. It's everything else, right? It's work and all those things. So I've got multiple jobs. I'm about to launch a company in Q1. So I'd love to tell you I can run 120 Ks a week in November, but who knows? I might not be able to get anywhere near that.
Yeah. I mean, I find this conversation, the correlation between just day-to-day stress, day-to-day health, and the impact that has on running to be so under talked about. And I mean, I feel like I'm fairly qualified to say it because it's something that over the course of 250 episodes here, it rarely comes up. I think people like Phil Maffetone do a brilliant job of coming at it with a bit more of a holistic approach. I mean, on the massive things, you can see it. We had to delay last week because I had gastro and I wasn't running. So it was like a direct correlation between,
Yep.
okay, well, this particular illness isn't allowing me to run. But then with the smaller things like that day-to-day stress, launching a business, I've got 2 kids, which are, oh man, far out. That's a whole other podcast episode.
Yep.
I love them, but man, there's plenty of stress that accompanies a couple of young kids.
Of course.
This is one particular area that I think a lot of people would be, like myself included, relatively oblivious to when it comes to, oh, why am I running poorly? Well, what happened? What happened over the last week? What's your life looking like over the last few weeks? Can you
Yeah.
unpack that a little?
Yeah, I guess so. You back to HRV. You mentioned Marco Altini. He's a good friend of mine. I've done quite a bit of running with Marco. He's just a great human, and um, I use his app to check my HRV in the morning, and I use an Aura Ring to check it overnight as well. And the things I've found correlate best with a poor recovery, so low HRV, is work stress, multiple Zoom calls, and lots of driving. If I'm doing either of those, my HRV will be tanked the next day. Versus people think the way it will work is, oh, I do a hard training session, then my HRV goes down. It's like, well, no, that training session was probably way too hard. If it really tanked your HRV, then it was way too hard, right? I've run marathons and had a fine HRV the next day. So, I think understanding what's different for you. Running is a stress reliever for me. It's not a stress. It doesn't add stress for me. It generally relieves it. So understanding that, and then using it as a feed forward thing and a learning piece, which is okay. So I know if I have too many Zoom calls in a day, then I'm going to struggle the next day to recover, or if I do too much driving. So I then plan appropriately ahead, right? So you mentioned that, you had gastro last week. I was actually really happy you canceled because I had a really full day, and you canceling meant that I ended up having some more spare time, right? And I was actually a little bit stressed out about how crazy last week was going to be. So it turned out to be a really good thing for me because I knew it's actually going to be tough, and I need to squeeze training in, and it's going to be hard, and then I don't know how I'm going to recover. So it's that sort of stuff where it allows you feedback on that to learn so that you can make better decisions going forward, I think. And I think that's where, I've spoken to the Norwegian boys, right? 2 of the world's best triathletes, about how they use tech. And generally their answer is, I use tech a ton in training so that I don't need to use it in a race, right? And to give context as to why is, like, it doesn't always work. I ran my second ever marathon. It was a Great Ocean Road Marathon, beautiful part of the world, unbelievable. Watch drop GPS. I was running blind. I had time only, no kilometer splits, and there's no kilometer markers on it because they don't mark the kilometers, and there's no drinks tables because if it's not a local pulling a trestle table down at the end of his driveway, you're not getting any drinks. So you got no idea where you are on the course. And so I was running along, and I was like, all right, well, here we go. So you need to learn that. You need to learn to race without that.
It's interesting hearing you talk about the Norwegian boys when it comes to triathlon, because I think often when it comes to the data points that are available to monitor progress, they're probably the first 2 that I think about. Like, it's interesting that it's got its limitations in their mind, or at least in practice, to being reserved mainly for training rather than racing. There's something nice about that. I always like the feeling of being released or unleashed a little bit on race day to go, all right, hey, like, as long as you're relatively smart about this and can be in the ballpark of what you're capable of for each kilometer split, you're not so tied to a watch. I often enjoy that process and think sometimes maybe we hold ourselves back to like our expectations of what we believe we're capable of in terms of a kilometer split in comparison to what we might actually be able to achieve if we sort of, tune in, switch off, and just give it a red hot crack.
Yeah, I think it's all about dialing in feeling, right? There's lots of people who are tech detractors who say, like, oh, you shouldn't be beholden to a watch, or, don't be beholden to your heart rate. It's like, you don't have that so that it holds you back unless you need it to, right? And I think that's one of the strengths of heart rate is in training. If you give people heart rates and you can't go over this, then if they're having a tough day or it's hot or whatever, like, it slows them down, right? So you can certainly use it to your advantage. But I think come race day, it's not about slowing you up. It's about making sure you're making the right decisions. So when I ran Berlin Marathon, I'd run, so this is a long story. I think listeners will get something out of this. I was training for the Boston Marathon. I was training to get into the Boston Marathon. I wanted to run. It was just the year that they dropped the time. It went from 3:05 to 3 hours. I was training, I was running Amsterdam, all good. Ran Amsterdam, ran 2:58, and the time required was like 2:56 because super shoes had just come in. And I wasn't wearing any. And I was so filthy at this. I said, listen, I'm not going to run Boston until I run a qualifier without super shoes. I don't care about all these people using super shoes. I'm going to do it without them. And then COVID hit and all sorts of stuff. Anyway, long story short, ended up running Rotterdam, ran 2:49 and I was like, cool, great. Got to run Boston, was so happy. Ran Boston in a pair of super shoes, awesome. But now I ran a PB in Boston in super shoes. It's like, okay, well, it's a PB, but also I don't know like what that actually means in terms of performance. Now I turn up to Berlin and I'm like, I have no idea how fast I can run because I've never run a flat marathon in these things now. So I'm pacing along in Berlin and thinking, I don't know if this is too fast or too slow. And I was going much faster than I thought I could. And I was like, looking at my heart rate. It's like, okay, heart rate looks good. I'm like, how's my breathing rate? I can nasal breathe. I'm like, okay, I think I'm okay. And I ran along with this other guy and had a good chat and it's really good. And we got to about 38 kilometers. And I said to him, mate, I think we're in really good shape here. We should push on. Like, let's go. Because I'm feeling good. He's like, mate, I'm cooked. You got to go. So I ended up running, dropping a bunch of 3:30s. I think I passed maybe 110 people in the last 4 kilometers because I was so fresh. And I'd obviously paced that way too easy, even though I was worried about going too fast. But the data allowed me to stay at that fast. Otherwise, I would have slowed down because I was so worried about how fast I was running. But the perception and the data gave me these extra data points to go, okay, no, you're good to push on here earlier in the race, let alone at 38Ks. So I think you can use it wisely to do that. And particularly, pacing marathons and half marathons is hard because you feel good at the start. There's all of your listeners, I'm sure, have gone, yeah, I've had one of those sessions where I've had one of those races where I went out a bit too hard, right? And that never feels good. I can tell you that is a horrible way to run them. I would rather run 100 where I get to 38Ks and go, oh, I can push on here and feel like maybe I left something out there than get to 30Ks and feel like I've gone way too hard and blow up because that is a horrible feeling.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned how you tuned into nasal breathing as a point of just checking where you're at. Is that something that you'll do regularly in a training session to find out like effort level? A lot of people say if you can hold a conversation, you're probably around zone 2. Nasal breathing is one which I've heard from people like Patrick McCown and James Nestor, but not a lot of people speak to it in great deal in the running world outside of them, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, there's a couple of guys. Brian McKenzie runs a page called Shift Adapt, or they're in a company called Shift Adapt, and it's all about breathing and breath and how it can help and in sports performance, not just running. But they sort of talk about gears, and the first gear they have is nasal in and out breathing. Right, you can breathe in and out through your nose, and then it's in through, and then gear 2 is in through your nose, out through your mouth, and then it's in through your mouth, out through your nose, something like this. Anyway, there's basically these gears, right? And that makes sense. The point being, if you can, it is possible that if you do a lot of nasal breathing and running, you can probably run zone 2 or above nasal breathing only. That takes some time and takes some training. And I think that may be helpful from a respiratory muscle training stimulus anyway, because there's some interesting research on respiratory muscle training as an undertaking to improve the efficiency of those muscles, just like we can improve your leg muscle efficiency or whatever, and they then require less oxygen and you fatigue less through the respiratory muscles, which is a key part of overall fatigue as well. So I do a little bit of nasal breathing in training on easy running, partially to restrict my intensity and make sure I'm not running too hard, partially to train the respiratory muscles. And then in the race, it's more to check in, is this really doable? If I can do this nasal breathing for a period of time without concerns, it's probably not too intense, right? Particularly for a marathon, right? That's kind of right in that marathon pace. You're probably going to be running faster than that at a half marathon anyway. But I often find that even just a couple of breaths in and out of nasal breathing helps calm me down a little bit as well, particularly if I'm hyperventilating or I'm like feeling it. And every now and again, I will do a bit of that, particularly when I'm doing longer marathon sessions. I do some sort of Renato Canova inspired stuff in my marathon blocks where I'll do, say, 3x10K at marathon pace. And in those, they can get very long very quickly, right? When you're sort of just starting your third one and you've got 10Ks left and you're already cooked, it's like it's nice to sort of reset a little bit and do some nasal breathing just to go like, no, we're okay here, we're sitting in this, it's going to be another 30 something minutes, just chill out and be cool.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I've been taping my mouth shut ever since I first read James Nestor's book a few years ago. It was funny, I used to think I had 2 sinus surgeries in my day. I've got quite like a narrow nasal passage. And I think I was inspired through reading his book just to try it out for a while, because you were speaking about the changes that you can see and the improvements that you can experience just through nasal breathing simply through applying it. You said a lot of the time we've just fallen into a bad habit of mouth breathing, but whether it's psychological or not, I can't tell you, but I always feel better when I've woken up from a night of sleep and I've had my mouth taped the entire night. If I wake up and I've got like no tape on my mouth, I've taken it off while I was asleep, and I might have a dry throat or a slight cough or whatever, it just feels yuck. Whereas when I wake up, there's like a certain level of energy, enthusiasm or whatever. Just high five myself for getting through 8 hours of, just nasal breathing. I don't know how it correlates to performance, but mentally you at least feel good.
Yeah, no, I felt the same thing. I started doing it well before that book was released. There's a couple of people I was following who suggested it, and I was like, oh, let's see how this goes here. It's confronting to do, right? It's intimidating. The first time you do it, you're like, oh, I don't know how I'll go here. And then once you get over that, it's refreshing, and it's low downside, right? It costs a couple bucks for a roll of tape. It'll last you, I don't know how many nights worth of sleeping, because you don't need to cover the whole mouth either. I was starting out doing the whole mouth, but really you just need to purse your lips together. I found it to be quite helpful. I mean, I track all the metrics. They all seem to agree for whatever that's worth. Improved sleep metrics and improved HRV and all those things. I certainly feel it perceptually as well, but it's really hard. Sleep particularly is hard to not fool yourself with from a placebo standpoint. There's some really interesting research looking at sleep trackers, right, and the problems with them, telling people they slept badly when they haven't, or they slept well when they haven't, and what that does to performance. So certainly these things are not without consequence, and you need to work really hard to not buy in 100% to them, because they're not 100% perfect.
Yeah, well, I've been trying to sleep in my Garmin. I've got a, what is it? I think it's a Forerunner 45S. So it's a few years old now. But one thing I noticed it might have been after speaking to Marco Altini, or I can't remember, but I started just tracking some of my sleep stats, and I was quickly made aware of how wrong this watch is on my stats. Like, I could be laying in bed wide awake, and I'll wake up in the morning and look at my watch, and it's like, yeah, you've had 8 hours and 12 minutes. 2 hours was deep sleep. I'm like, I was up for 4 hours last night with my kid. I know, I feel exhausted. Everything you just told me is false. Plus, like, I just feel uncomfortable sleeping in a watch. I actually don't like it. I feel like I have to be on one particular side of my body. So it's just a little bit yuck. So I've sort of just given up on tracking sleep data with that. I think maybe like an Oura ring might be a better point of entry for me, or even like a Whoop band, something a little smaller.
Yeah, I agree completely. I've slept in watches and that, and people often say to me, oh yeah, I love sleeping in a watch. It's like, there's the component of it's uncomfortable and I feel funny about it and all those things. There's also the component of those things are gross. Like, you're wearing them to sweat in. I don't know if I want that in my bed. I felt the same. Look, I've used a Whoop. I didn't think so at the time, but now I'm reflecting on, I'm like, I don't know if I want that thing in my bed. So certainly that. I think Oura rings are fine. They're probably the best researched one. Fitbit was the second best, but now it doesn't exist anymore because it's owned by Google, I believe. Bought Fitbit. So there's a lot of stuff on the market. The ones with the research, the best research is Aura. All of them, I'd say, like the real high level is kind of, they're pretty good at sleep or awake. So sleep wake, what they call 2-stage sleeping. When they get to 4-stage sleeping, which is light, deep, REM, etc., they get pretty murky. But there's also a certain amount of disagreement if we looked at your polysomnography, which is looking at the neurology of these things. With sleep scientists, there's a certain amount of disagreement anyway on these things. So it's a little bit hard. There were some on the market previously commercially, which are no longer commercial, which went around your head and started to look at brainwaves, which is a better way to do it. But yeah, those things aren't particularly popular for the same reason that wearing a watch is uncomfortable. You don't want to wear something around your head to sleep with either. But it's going to they're all going to misinterpret, because they use a mixture of things like heart rate. So they only really measure a handful of things. Some of them measure temperature, and that'll change a little bit. Some of them, they all pretty much measure heart rate, and then most of them will measure a level of movement. And then from that heart rate, they take HRV, or they interpret HRV, which is pretty reasonable. Then they sort of interpret breath rate or respiratory rate, which is, it's not as good, but it's okay. But now we're starting to then use all of those metrics to then layer on top our sleep algorithm, right? And so as we go from measuring something to estimating something else, we start to introduce areas of error. So the reason your Garmin thought you were asleep when you're lying there with your kid is because you were breathing deeply, lying still, and whatever else. So then it goes, okay, well, this looks like deep sleep because of the time of the day. I used to have a watch, and I won't say the brand because I don't want to talk too badly about them, but the watch would require you to say when you slept normally. So basically, its sleep algorithm would only record in hours when you usually slept. And I was like, this is backwards. This doesn't make sense. So anyway.
Yeah, that's so interesting. When you wake up, like, what are some of the main points of call when it comes to data that you're checking? Obviously, HRV you've mentioned.
Yep.
What else are you looking at to monitor recovery and readiness to train, or even from like a even just from a general health and wellness perspective? I mean, there's some interesting stats to look into there as well.
Yeah, so maybe I'll give you a bit of a rundown of the morning routine. I sort of get up. I sleep with my phone in a different room. It's a health hack for everybody. I think it's one of the best things you could do is sleep with your phone in a different room and be really mindful about not engaging with it until you're ready. I engage with it pretty quickly because I sync all my wearables. But so I will check my stats from. I have a sleep mattress that modifies temperature across the night called an 8 Sleep. It also tracks a bunch of these metrics. So it tracks HRV and breathing rate and heart rate and all that stuff, as well as changes all the the temperature stuff. And so I use that. I use an Aura Ring, and so I sync those and have a bit of a look at them more out of interest than anything else. I mean, they disagree all the time. They're completely different, and like that's okay. I don't really care too much. They're directionally similar on HRV and directionally the same on things like respiratory rate and heart rate. I do keep an eye on those two from a health perspective. I think they are better canaries in the coal mine. So respiratory rate specifically is a good one. If it's grossly changed, then I usually would be a bit aware. I then take my morning HRV using Marco's app, HRV for training. And one of the things that HRV for training does, which I think is really important, and it's probably the most important thing you could do, is asks a bunch of subjective questions. How'd you sleep? How sore are you? How recovered do you feel? How, all these things. What we call in sports science POMS, profile of mood state. And those check-ins, it's what our coaches used to do to us when we were 16, 17. Hey, mate, how you doing? How you feeling? How's school going? All these things. And based on how you respond and those answers, that sort of gives a good indication of how you're feeling subjectively. And that still, I wouldn't say trumps objective measures, but is certainly as strong and as valid a data point. And so that when HRV for training gives you your training advice for the day, it kind of uses HRV and those subjective measures to tell you, green light, red light, or yellow light. So I do that and then consider in the context of all that. And Jamie Stanley is an Australian sports scientist from the SASI, South Australian Sports Institute, who's written a bit about this. His writing's very good about it. Sort of how you'd make a decision in the context of a low HRV and variable soreness scores and those sort of things. And basically the take home is I wouldn't jump at shadows on one measurement. I'd be looking at a couple of them, understanding context and making decisions based on that. So I wouldn't do a hard session on a day that I, had a really low HRV and got like a red score from HRV for training. But certainly on days where it's yellow or something like that, I might say, still give it a nudge, or maybe I'll ease off a couple reps or drop that intensity a little bit. Maybe I'll do that at marathon pace, not at half marathon or 10K pace. So certainly modify things around there. But again, my primary stress is everything that isn't training. So I'm hesitant to change training too much in that context. It's certainly the modifiable factor, or the most easily modified, but it's probably not going to move the needle for me either, changing it too much. But
Yeah.
I guess the most important thing there is you're not going to absorb that training super well.
Yeah, sure. And did you say at the moment you're doing 2 more intense training sessions as a part of your training week?
Yeah, so at the moment, basically, I'll do like a pretty classic Australian system, kind of. It's sort of evolved over decades for me now, but basically Monday I do easy sort of couple of Ks, somewhere 6 to 8 Ks in the morning. I'll do gym in the evening. Tuesday is usually sort of 13, 14 kilometers with intensity. That what I do there will vary based on goals. At the moment, I'm pretty far from anything, and so I'm looking at a lot of faster stuff. So faster than VO2 max type pace. So 300s, 400s, a lot of that sort of stuff to try and maintain or improve. Let's go short distance a little bit. I don't want to use terms like speed and VO2 max because they're a bit misnomers, but that sort of faster stuff. So the other week I did a bunch of 400s off a minute rather than doing sort of kilometers off, say, a minute and a half, 2 minutes to really try and keep the pace high. So if I did, say, 8 by a kilometer, I'd be pretty comfortable doing that somewhere between 320s and 330s per kilometer for 8 by K without too much concern. I was running these 400s closer to 3 or 305 pace. So trying to be faster than my kilometer pace, so to speak. And for context, I've never run faster than a 259 kilometer in my life for 1K. So that was my PB on track when I was, 17 and 75 kilos in spikes being paced to it. So we are nudging, lifetime best here in terms of like paces. So Doing so that's Tuesday. Wednesday, I do like a sort of midweek long run, so to speak. So about 20 Ks. Thursday will be pretty similar to Tuesday, although sometimes, when I'm in more structured training and I'm not looking at weaknesses, that might be more of a threshold emphasis or classic thresholds. I've started doing a bit more blended sessions where I do a bit of both in both sessions. So instead of going like a VO2 max and a thresholds traditional stuff, I might do a bit of both in both. And I will, at the moment I'm doing probably more speed emphasis or faster, shorter stuff in both. And then Fridays, same as Monday, easy sort of 6 8Ks and then gym. And then Saturday is usually an easy somewhere between 6 and 10Ks, maybe a bit more depending on what's happening. And then Sunday long run, anywhere 30Ks at the moment. It's probably, I did sort of 25 the last few weeks. I'll probably go up to 30 soon. As it transitions to marathon specific stuff, as it transitions to a pre-marathon build, that 30Ks will blow right out. That'll get up to 40Ks some weeks. Those sessions will be, probably more traditional sort of VO2 max and then a threshold session, and total volume will bump up a bit. And then when I get into a marathon block, I go to basically jogging all days except Wednesday, Sunday, where my like midweek long run and my long run are, and those start to have marathon intensity built into them. So they'll have true marathon pace built into them, and that'll be progressive. So 4x3K, 3x4K, 3x5K, 3x6K, 3x7K, 2x8K, 2x and then after 2x8K it's 16K, so 10 mile is the Wednesday, and then the Sunday goes a bunch of sessions that are variable, but culminating in 3x10K basically at marathon pace with kilometer float between.
And how far out from race day would you do that 3x10K session?
2 weeks. So everyone freaks out. Yeah, everyone freaks out and thinks like it's not enough time. But my argument is, if I can do 3x9K with a kilometer float between, and then 7 days later, after 8 weeks of marathon builds, do 3x10K, you can't. And provided I'm hitting paces, right? You can't tell me then that I'm going to take more than another 2 weeks to recover from that. So, Marco Altini actually posted this morning about his taper leading into a marathon he ran that was really good last year, and tagged me in it. And his taper was something like he did 2 intense sessions, which is rare for him. Plus he ran long one day, and then ran it wasn't a max effort marathon, but he ran a very good marathon for him. It's about 12 minutes off his PB, jogging it on the Sunday pretty easily without no taper at all, basically. So I think taper is something we misunderstand a lot. Again, I don't want to sort of ride the coattails of the Norwegian boys too much because I have very little to do with them. I just podcast for them. But they famously 2 years ago in Kona did basically a full Ironman triathlon about 10 days out across 2 days. They did the full swim and then half the bike one day, and then the next day they did the other half of the bike and a full marathon, basically 40Ks, with marathon intensity stuff in there, right? So it's not to say that everyone should be running marathons the week before, but I just think that taper is about being fresh enough. And I think sometimes we can overemphasize the rest, right? Because I don't think anybody thinks the best taper is 2 weeks in bed, right? Do absolutely nothing, lie dead still for 2 weeks. So if we concede complete rest isn't important or isn't the most important thing, and we concede that running your race the day before the race is not the way to do it, we have to hit somewhere between those two. So how do we find the right amount of balance, right? And the research would say, cut 60 to 80% for 2 weeks and maintain frequency and maintain intensity. But it's you have to feel good about it. When I was in medical school, I did a bunch of racing. I was running trail races pretty much once a month, roughly a half marathon with about 1,000 meters elevation in it. And I was running about to my capacity or what I thought they could be. And my only taper would be skipping Friday gym. I would otherwise do the same week. And I could probably have eked out a couple more percentage points of performance, but I just think that we sometimes overemphasize the need for this taper and underemphasize a lot of this is just about how fit are you? On some level, you still need to just have done the work.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Matt, the one thing that I was super curious before I let you go. So when you go from your average 100K week to say your 110K week, when you're in big marathon build up, are you still doing so you're doing the 2 midweek sessions and that session on a Sunday, or would that longer midweek? Okay, that one gets switched out for your Sunday session.
So my longer midweek, so I'll do a Wednesday, Sunday session, and that long Sunday session is one intensity, and the other intensity is a Wednesday session. So the Tuesday, Thursday become jogs instead of being intense sessions. So I think
Yeah.
I've done that similar build for like 3-4 marathons in a row. It's been really successful for me. But I think on reflection, I think I've negated all other intensities too much. So I've been too specific with marathon pace, because it's pretty much for 8 weeks I do nothing but marathon pace, right? And I think that's probably a little bit narrow-sighted. I think I should probably touch on some faster stuff every now and again. So I would probably do a couple more blended sessions in there. And to be fair, some of the Sunday sessions are a little bit quicker. Like there's a session that I stole from Nick Badeau, which I probably have no right to be doing because I'm probably nowhere near fit enough. But it's like an hour easy, 30-minute threshold, 10 by 1 minute hard, 1 minute easy, 5K fast, right? And that has gone really well for me in winters, and it's gone very bad for me in summers in my blocks. I've worked that out, that it was heat related, but I guess what I'm getting at there is I do a couple of sessions where I go a bit faster. Another session where I do it's like 10, 15 seconds faster than marathon pace, and do 10, 15 seconds slower, and do 10 by a K above, K below. So there's certainly some faster running in there, but I just think that I might be better off doing, maybe if I say that those 2 sessions a week are both marathon intensity, I might be best off swapping out one session every 2 weeks to be a little bit faster, and do a bit of a mixed session where I do some true threshold running and some fast and threshold running, just to maintain that ability. Because I think I'm probably leaving a couple of bits of performance on the table by not doing more of that.
Yeah, man, so interesting, dude. I could talk to you all day about like probably every subject that you've spent years studying, but for the sake of you having a productive day, I'm going to love you and leave you. But mate, I'm glad we got an opportunity to touch base. If you want to do a round 2, let me know. We'll line it up.
Always,
I'd love to have you back
always
on.
keen. Always keen for a round 2. You let me know when suits you, and we'll make it happen again. And especially if listeners are interested, right? Like ultimately, this is a gift to the listeners. It's not about you and I. We can talk offline. So if listeners, maybe if listeners let you know they want me back, then happy to join you again, and we can go that way.
We'll let them guide it. All right, brother. Hey, thanks again.
All right.